everyone! Here is my in-depth look at La Villa Strangiato by Rush. This piece really has a lot to offer when we start to look closely because it's quite well developed, musically speaking. So let's just dive right in. First, what inspired it? Well, if you're a Rush fan, you probably already know the story. But for the rest of us, Alex Lifeson is the guitarist of the band, and at one point, he had some dreams, some nightmares, which he shared with his bandmates. And turns out those tales were the spark for their musical imaginations, and that's what started this piece growing. The work itself is subtitled An Exercise in Self-Indulgence, which I assume alludes to this fact that it's about personal dreams. But it turned out great. It doesn't come across as weirdly navel-gazing, inwardly focused, not at all. It's a vibrant, dynamic, interesting piece which catches the ear even if you know nothing about it at all. And once we do start to become familiar with its details, it begins to feel like a dramatic fairy tale type story with plenty of room for imaginative interpretation along the way. This piece is purely instrumental, but when looking at the published score, we find out that each section has its own title, and these titles are really quite inventive when in their use of the language. And here are a few that really sparkle. I kind of like them. The first section is called Buenas noches, freinds, and it's a mashup of butchered Spanish and German. The spelling is terrible. It's hilarious to read. Another section is called To Sleep, Perchance to Dream, and of course you might recognize that as being lifted straight out of Shakespeare's famous To Be or Not to Be soliloquy. A lurks in Wonderland? That's the band's nickname for Alex Lifeson. And it kind of plays around with the idea of Alex in Wonderland. And remember, this is based on Alex's dreams. And then there's a section called The Ghost of Aragon. Aragon is a region in Spain which traces itself all the way back to the medieval kingdom of Aragon. I have no idea how this ended up in a Canadian band member's dreams, but hey, why not? And then, of course, we have the name of the entire piece. La Villa is Spanish, truly, but Strangiato is a made-up word, sort of a fusion of Spanish and Italian. In fact, there's an Italian word, strangiato, which means strangled, but here, it's obviously meant to communicate strange. I also read that it is an actual place in Italy. Apparently, it was the home of a Baron Strangiato, but I did a quick search and it didn't bring up any reliable info about that. I don't know if that's true or not, and even if it's true, it seems so obscure that I'm really not sure the band would have even been aware of its existence. So I tend to think they invented the word for themselves. Now, thinking about all this Spanish influence, all these Spanish-sounding words included in this piece of music, maybe Aragon isn't so far out of context after all. Maybe it's just their way of giving an exotic strangeness to the whole piece, since it is, after all, a mysterious dream world. What I'd like to do here is to go through the piece, section by section, in order, and tell you a bit about what I find in each part of the story. So let's break down the various sections and their titles. Buenas noches, freinds. This is the opening of the piece. And it really sounds like the Spanish classical guitar style. Lyrical, sensitive, expressive, emotive. Before launching into a fiery passage reminiscent of the flamenco tradition, interestingly, again, we see the Spanish influence appear in the music itself. Not just the names assigned to some of the musical sections, but here it's the whole musical style. And if you love the sound of this opening, I did, you'll probably also love a lot of classical Spanish guitar music. Guitarists like Segovia, Julian Bream, Carlos Montoya, Sabicas, playing music by Villalobos, Rogdrigo, Torroba. I'm including several links in the description, and I'll be curious if any of them appeal to you. One of the ways in which purely instrumental music can satisfy us is by imitating the melodic lines of sung music. And I think I've mentioned before how classical music originated and how it is steeped in vocal music, both solo and choral, both sung and rhetorical. And every instrumentalist, classical instrumentalist at least, has to approach it from this perspective if they are going to understand and handle the music to its fullest potential. Well, of course, as the craft and art of classical music developed, it became more complex, more elaborate, and all kinds of music came pouring out which didn't use the voice at all. In fact, not relying on the voice actually helped to free its development because the human voice has limitations. Limits of range, limits of dynamics, limits of agility, speed, articulation. Instruments can do things the voice simply cannot do. But still, because the voice is such a native human quality, when an instrument works in the style of the voice, with melody, rhythm, and tone, we find it fundamentally satisfying, rewarding, and relatable. And that's what we hear in the opening of La Villa. The first three phrases are easily, naturally singable, and even when it takes flight in a virtuosic flurry of notes, it still has a melodic contour, a sense of line, and even a natural breathing space at the end of it. To sleep, perchance to dream. The second section of this piece makes use of a literary reference to Shakespeare. Of course, naturally leaning towards the sleep and dream experience rather than Shakespeare's original meditations on death. And this portion of the music evokes a dreamlike atmosphere set up on a single chord, C major plus a added D note. It's incredibly beautifully layered. The first few bars establish a hypnotic atmosphere, but instead of staying there, it builds, adding textures and layers and instruments and colors, and there is zero harmonic development, but it's actually not needed, and in fact, in my opinion, it would interfere and detract from the effect if there were. Instead, everything is all about the subtle overlapping, adding, and progressive coloring in, each part contributing to an overall gathering of forces, so that by the time we come to the end, we're in a state of expectation and suspense in the midst of this rich tapestry of sound. One little detail I want to point out. Towards the end of this section, starting very faintly about minute 116 and becoming increasingly present from then on, is the bass part. If you listen to the music, notice its rhythm here in the bass. 3 repeated notes. Bum, 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 bum. And then compare with the main Strangiato theme, which enters at minute 2. That bass part is foreshadowing the main theme. The theme itself is not present in this dream section, but by this foreshadowing technique, combined with the orchestral build-up, we get a seamless transition into Strangiato. Not only is it musically great, but it also does a wonderful job of evoking the strange way in which dreams morph from one thing to another, often unrelated, in our sleep experiences. And so we step into Strangiato theme. This section is not a theme. It's more like a collection of several themes or motifs, each of them quite strong in its own right. For example, that main theme that I was talking about, the guitar building up to bum, 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 bum. That's the first thing we hear in this Strangiato section. And here we hear it on the guitar. Bum, bum, bum. Well, of course, my harp doesn't give that same sound. But here's what it would be. You'll recognize that from the song itself. And by switching abruptly between these themes, we're kept on edge, unsettled, ill at ease, just as we might imagine we'd feel if we stepped into a strange city where things were happening rapidly and we really don't understand what's safe, what's normal, what's connected or related, and what isn't. All kinds of things are happening all around us, but because we are unfamiliar, we don't know what our anchor or reference point is. So we stand there bewildered as this strange world whizzes past us. But it's not only the bouncing between motifs or riffs that make us feel ill at ease. It's also the harmonic outline that we find in the angular melodic line of this last theme that I showed you. Remember, I said near the beginning that when we imitate the natural tendencies of the human voice, it's inviting and it's comfortable. We can also use the opposite to fine effect. Play something which is awkward for the voice, and we get something that is uncomfortable, unsettling. And that is what happens here. The melody itself is a bit hard to sing. You might do pretty well if you're singing along with the instruments, but try pausing the music and sing it unsupported, and you'll find that it leaps around at sharp angles and lands in odd places that are really quite awkward. And then we can also notice the two chords which this particular melody outlines, C major to F sharp major. Now, if you've watched my other videos, you might remember I've talked about the diabolus in musica, the augmented fourth, or sometimes we call it the diminished fifth. I've talked about it a couple times. Well, here, we are not hearing it melodically in the same way that it featured in those other songs. But it's still here. This time, found in the distance between the two supporting chords. And here's how it looks. This is my C major chord. Now, to get to my F sharp major, it's very unrelated. None of those notes belong. And what happens is this melody, and here's where it comes to that F sharp that has no relationship to the C major. And all these elements combine to give us a wonderfully strange musical experience. Another great transition happens as we move from this Strangiato place into the section called A Lurks in Wonderland. It's as if we are magically set down into this wonderland via a simple chord difference at the end of the final Strangiato running scale. In Strangiato, the descending scale always arrived on an A major chord like this. This is A major. But now suddenly it ends on an F chord, like this. And you can hear the difference. With the A chord, we have a semitone between the last two notes. But to arrive at the F chord, that final note has to drop lower as a C natural, giving us the sensation of opening, spaciousness, as well as calm. It's as if some giant just plucked us out of the bewildering frenzy of a place we don't understand and immediately placed us in the middle of a cool, calm, magical scene. And we're standing, or even floating there, a bit bewildered, while also fascinated, relieved, able to breathe. If I go slowly, you can hear the effect. A lurks in Wonderland. Another small detail which helps create this weightlessness, this suspension of time, is time. Notice that as soon as we arrive on this first F chord, something feels ever so slightly different in the rhythm. There's both a sense of lift and a feeling of oddness, and it happens because one tiny portion of the preceding beat pattern is shaved off. In technical terms, it changes from 4/4 to 7/8. In simple, everyday terms, I could explain it kind of like this. Imagine that you're a kangaroo, leaping along. 1, 2, and 3, and 4, and. Notice how you land and launch on each number count. 1 and 2. And the midpoint between the counts, where I'm placing the word and, is the peak, the highest, lightest point of the leap. Just like when you were a kid on a swing, when you reached to the top with enough momentum, you felt weightless. Now suppose this kangaroo somehow finds a way to begin the next leap at the midpoint, that weightless peak of the fourth leap, like this. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and I put and 1 as close together as possible so you can see, but this time I'm going to get rid of the and simply say 1. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4, 1 and 2 and. See how your hand, or the kangaroo, seems to lightly spring into the next leap. It doesn't feel so heavy. 4, 1, there's less force and more float. But it still moves forward, still has forward direction. In fact, it arrives early because we've cut off that and. We start leap number 1 before leap number 4 is fully even finished. That's what happens here. And it helps to set up this Wonderland sensation. I also love what the guitar does here. Remember I said during my first listen that it reminds me of a traditional Romanian panpipe type instrument. But in that moment I couldn't remember the exact name of it. Well, it's called a nai. And if you love this part of the music, here's a link to something incredibly beautiful that I think you will also love. And then going on, the music builds again. We experience all kinds of wonders and excitement. Another cool thing to notice is that this whole Lurks in Wonderland experience is Alex's first guitar solo in the piece. And remember, Lurks is his nickname. And it was his dreams that provided the inspirational seed for the whole musical work. Really, I think it's quite fitting. Then the music moves into what feels like a sort of prelude, built off of broken chords, and suddenly we feel the adrenaline start pounding again. We've discovered monsters. Right about minute 5:49, the next section arrives, simply titled Monsters, and it sounds quite menacing. There's something about the idea of monsters that appeals to little boys. Have you ever noticed how many boys love monsters and prehistoric beasts and dinosaurs? They love the scariness and the strangeness of it all. As a teacher, I don't have a lot of little girls walking into my studio saying, "I want to play something that sounds like monsters." But if I have a restless little boy at the piano, chances are pretty high that if I pull out a menacing sounding piece of music, or something titled Monsters, or some name of a prehistoric creature, he'll dive right in. And I imagine that this section of the music is the little boy character of the Rush band members shining through. It sounds to me like they love to play this part. The bass gets lively, the guitar digs in. It's as if they all said, "Hey, let's really let them hear about monsters." Well, there's also a story about this part of the music that I want to share. I discovered it as I was researching about the song and the band. It turns out that this theme is not original to Rush. It featured in a lot of Warner Brothers cartoons during the 40s and 50s. But it wasn't even originally written or intended for cartoons. It was actually a song composed by someone named Raymond Scott in 1936, titled Powerhouse. And I'll include a link for you to check it out and compare to what we're hearing in this Rush piece. It's practically identical. But the tune featured in so many cartoons: Merry Melodies, Looney Tunes, The Simpsons, Animaniacs, the list goes on and on. So who knows exactly where Rush picked it up from? Anyway, eventually, Raymond Scott's publisher found out and notified the Rush band that they were in violation of copyright. But by that time, the statute of limitations had already expired. So technically, Rush no longer had any legal obligations. But here's what I appreciate about this story. In spite of the fact that they had no legal obligation, Rush's management, out of deference to Mr. and Mrs. Scott, and believing it was the ethical thing to do, offered to give a payment anyway. So they worked out a one-time sort of penance payment in exchange for their use of the tune. Raymond was still alive at that point, and what I read, is that all involved were happy with the resolution, and that's how it finished. I enjoyed discovering this story because in my reading about other rock bands and artists, it's become obvious that a lot of conflicts and lawsuits, breakups, splits in the bands, and animosity exist in this sphere. And it was simply refreshing to discover one situation in which respect and dignity ruled the day. Anyway, this Monsters section doesn't last very long, and actually, listening to the piece without the sheet music in front of you, it can be hard to pick out where one section ends and the next one begins, because we go rapidly from Monsters to The Ghost of Aragon to Danforth and Pape to The Waltz of the Shrieves to Never Turn Your Back on a Monster, and I'm not sure there's a lot that can be known about why these titles are chosen or what exactly the music represents here, other than that they belong in Alex's dream world. But it's musically exciting regardless. As we're charging through Monsters, there's a point at which the guitar comes to a sudden moment of silence. And then the bass goes wild with its own virtuosic show-off moment. That's the point at which we have arrived at The Ghost of Aragon. It's all very intense here, and the guitar re-enters with a wonderful sequence of big chromatic chords, kind of reminding me of Chopin and Rachmaninoff combined, you think of the pianists who just go bum 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 bum. That's kind of what the guitar is doing. I really feel like this section is a sort of bass solo moment, which then transitions into a drum solo. Now, in the earlier section, To Sleep, Perchance to Dream, it was built around the combining and layering and weaving together of all the various instruments, one after the other, textures stacked on top of each other. Now here, each instrument is treated more individually, getting its own opportunity to shine, passing from the guitar solo to the bass to the drums and back again. Danforth and Pape. Then we arrive at Danforth and Pape. According to what I've learned, these are the names of two streets at an intersection in downtown Toronto. Really quite a long way from Aragon. On the recording, it happens around minute 6:40, and at first, it feels so similar to what preceded it that we don't really experience it as new or different. But as this section progresses, it does begin to take on a shape and character of its own as a second guitar solo. Now, I've never been to Toronto, much less to this particular intersection, so I don't know how much of this part of the music is really descriptive of the real place and how much of it is merely inspired by whatever Alex was dreaming. But to me, well, I can quite easily imagine a busy traffic intersection with constant motion, engines accelerating, vehicles turning this way and that. It gives that sort of quality to it. The Waltz of the Shrieves. Is this an allusion to Waltz of the Flowers? And then suddenly we find ourselves with the Waltz of the Shrieves at 7:26. Again, I wanted to know what this title was about, and couldn't find anything really reliable. My first thought was that maybe it's a play on Tchaikovsky's famous Waltz of the Flowers, but then I read somewhere that Shrieves is a nickname for the band's roadies, or perhaps it's just a made-up name for some creatures in his dreams. Anyway, it's a wonky little section. They do keep the triple feel, but just barely, because the music is constantly switching from 1 to 2 and sometimes 3 triples and back again. So it sounds a bit angular, cartoonish, tongue-in-cheek. Is Alex dreaming of them giving a concert in this strange city, perhaps near an intersection resembling one he knows in real life? Are the Shrieves representing the roadies busy cheerily setting up the equipment for the concert? But never turn your back on the monster. Funnily enough, this continues the waltz rhythm at 7:52, as if the monster has snuck up while we're engaged with other scenes or activities, something to do with this Waltz of the Shrieves that just passed. There's something really clever I want to show you about this little section in connection with the main monsters theme. Even though it doesn't sound exactly like what we think the monsters theme sounds like, it actually is that same theme, just with a different rhythmic setup. Here's the monsters theme as we know it, but on the harp. And here it is in the bass part, what we hear in the bass. It's a bit simplified, but still the same thing. You hear that it's the same notes, although they're straightened a bit. You can hear that the guitar part has a couple added little tweaks, rhythmic things. The notes are slightly fancier, more elaborate. But let's take the bass part that I just showed you of the monsters, which is the main outline of the theme, and just switch the rhythm to a triple feel. Suddenly, we have exactly what the guitar is singing in Never Turn Your Back. And that's what you'll hear there in the guitar part. So we're subconsciously being primed for the return of these monsters which happens at exactly minute 8. Monsters, reprise. Strangiato theme, reprise. And from here, we're basically recapping the primary themes, because after revisiting monsters, we go directly to a reprise of the Strangiato theme. And finally, the whole piece is concluded in a miniature section, more like a coda, Farewell to Things, where, once more, we hear the monsters referenced, finishing with a final flourish of the wonderful descending sequence of chromatic chords that I mentioned earlier from The Ghost of Aragon. And that's it! We come slamming to a halt. I guess we just woke from our dream? Well, I should mention that when I first read the title of this coda section, A Farewell to Things, I was a bit confused. It didn't have the same colorful, imaginative ring to it that the names for the other sections carried. But I think I misunderstood it. I was thinking of things in terms of how we typically use it. Material items, or stuff. As in, a farewell to material items, materialism, or a farewell to stuff. But after looking at the music here, I have a different idea of what A Farewell to Things is talking about. I think things is being used to refer to all the mysterious, unidentifiable characters in this story, this dream. It is a dream, after all. What do? Give them an actual identity? We don't typically do that. Instead, we wake up, shrug, say, well, that was wild. Now on with real life. Goodbye, things, or whatever you are. Anyway, to me, it makes more sense to think of that as the use of the word in this title here. Now that we've gone through all those musical details, perhaps you can understand why I enjoyed my first listen as much as I did, and why I'm also eager to explore a bit more of Rush. Of course, I know their work is quite varied, and just because I like this particular piece doesn't guarantee that I'll like anything or everything else, but I will explore them some more in the future, and you will get to watch it happen. Now at the end, I have a little announcement to make. Due to the upcoming birth and other events in our life, this month's poll is going to be the last one for a little while, so you might want to go there and vote your favorite band, but, as always, pay attention. Remember that Vlad doesn't count the comments which include more than the artist's name and the song's name, because it's too much to wade through a lot of verbiage. I'll see you soon.